Hello, everyone. We are starting a new unit today about the body and identity in visual culture. And as always, we're starting in the ancient world. This definition is going to be pretty broad because we're going to go all the way up to the 17th century, but we're going to start in ancient Egypt. And our guiding questions for this unit are as follows. To what extent do ancient cultures use naturalism? Remember, naturalism is depicting something as it appears in the natural world, as it appears in real life. Or to what extent do ancient cultures use abstraction in the depiction of people? What other axes of identity are included in that depiction of human figures? And by that I mean things like gender, class, race, social status, occupation, religion. I'm sure you can think of a few more to add to that list. All of these different elements that make us who we are. And then finally, what do we learn about a culture when examining how they depict human figures in art? And by that I mean that in this work, in the depiction of human figures, we might learn something about the belief system, about the values, about the kind of approach in different cultures. All right, as I said, we're starting again in Egypt. Oops, and it looks like I didn't clean up something in the slide, but we have talked about Egypt before quite a bit, and we're going back to the Old Kingdom, and we're going to look at two different sculptures here that show us two very different approaches to the human form. The first sculpture is Menkaure and his wife. Let's see if I can pronounce this here. Khmeremnebti from Giza. So this is Khafre's son, the pharaoh Khafre, his son and his daughter-in-law. And Menkaure, one of his pyramids is one of the great pyramids in Giza. And we see that the king and queen here are united by the single stone from which they are carved. And then we also see how the queen is kind of embracing the king in this symbolic embrace. They really exude a kind of dignity, calm, permanence. They are depicted as eternally youthful as well. We don't see a single blemish, a single wrinkle. In fact, they appear almost kind of stiff, as if they were made from the same cookie cutter, and that's because Egyptians, when depicting members of the royal family, they used a canon of proportions from which all statues of royal figures were made, and so they're very formulaic, very static. That's so different than this sculpture here of a scribe from Saqqara. This is also Old Kingdom Egypt. Look at the kind of how human this figure looks. We don't see these, this kind of static stance here, these kind of awkward, poses with their fists at the sides, weight equally balanced, but instead we see a scribe. We see a little bit of flub here on his midsection. We have more naturalism. He's seated here doing his, we see him engaged in his job, and that is to be a scribe. That is to be a scribe at the royal court. And this is a very respected position. Scribes were not just, we shouldn't think of them as secretaries, but they were really important scholars. And we see how he's in the act of writing. We see a much more human quality, more lifelike. He's not idealized. And this is more typical for these non-royal portraits. All right, we're going to spend a great deal of time focused on the Eastern Mediterranean here, and specifically the Peloponnesus. This is the Greek peninsula. The Aegean Sea, which includes all of these islands, these small islands called the Cyclades, and then this big island of Crete here in the south. And we're going to look at the depiction of human figures from three different pre-Greek cultures in the Aegean: the Cycladic civilization, the Minoan civilization, and the Mycenaean civilization. We're looking to cultures that were more or less contemporary with ancient Egypt and who predate the Greeks that we will move to later. But let's start with the Cycladic civilization and this fascinating little sculpture of a musician. This is a male lyre player, kind of a harp, and the material here is marble. This is the main material for sculpture and architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we see this sculpture is pretty small, just a few inches tall, but it is fully developed sculpture in the round. So it's not just reliefs, not just carved on one side. And we have this male figure seated with his hands out, ready to strum the harp, and his head fully tilted back. The harp has this kind of neat little elaborate ornament on the front, and there's evidence that this marble sculpture was painted. Remember that paint is something that was almost always an element of form in these ancient works, but that doesn't survive to us today. The significance of this figure is unclear. We don't really know who this person is, what the importance is here, whether we're witnessing some sort of religious ritual. But what we do see is how in the Cycladic civilization, the human form is reduced to geometric shapes. So the kind of simple triangle here of the nose, the long elongated rectangles. This is much more on the abstracted side of human form, as opposed to the more naturalistic portrayals that we'll see later. All right, what we're looking at here is a vase that's carved out of soapstone. Soapstone is a really soft stone, and it's this kind of ostrich egg-shaped vessel that was used for pouring liquids during ceremonies. And what we see in this horizontal band, it's a little bit abstract, and I think it's maybe easier to see in the left-hand picture here, is we see this really boisterous procession of men around the vase. It's this exuberant scene of harvesters. We see huge sheaths of wheat in the background. We have figures who are unordered, they're overlapping each other, we can't clearly see all of the individual figures. But there's an interest in anatomy, clearly. These figures are much more naturalistic, and we see that, for example, here. If you look where I'm pointing, we can actually see the exposed ribs and the open mouth of that figure, as if he's taking a deep breath to shout or to sing. This represents a kind of shift in the approach to the human form. And we're also going to see this kind of greater naturalism in a very different expression in the Mycenaean warrior's vase. So the harvester vase is Minoan, this second of the third pre-Greek civilizations in the Aegean. The warrior's vase is Mycenaean, and I know those names are similar, and just to confuse things even more, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans both lived on that big island of Crete, but they were so different. The Minoans are kind of like the Aegean hippies. They were farmers, they were peaceful people, they lived in harmony with nature, whereas the Mycenaeans, they were warriors, they were conquerors. And what we're looking at here is this huge mixing bowl for water and wine. Typically, wine was not consumed by itself, but it was always mixed. They were always making wine spritzers, I guess. And what we see here is, again, a greater interest in naturalism of the human form, but these figures are so rigid. There's no show of emotion. There's no sense of that kind of chaotic energy that we saw in the harvester's vase, but instead the focus really here is on the armor, on the weaponry, the uniforms. There's no love of nature, there's no organic line, but it's this row of soldiers in repetition, in lockstep uniformity across the vase. All right, if we compare these two works side to side, I think those contrasts really come out well here. And we're going to end right here, and then when I come back, we are going to transition into the Greek civilization.